thank you, Josie and Bob, and to the Metro DC Council for having me here this morning. I was thinking that this is a little bit of a homecoming. I haven't been as active, but for those who don't know, I was a student at Catholic University and led the Pax Christi chapter there, and we would sometimes meet up with the Metro DC folks. So I'm glad to be back. I was going through some photos about 2 weeks ago, and I came across some of our photos from the SOA back in 2008. So this is some of the Catholic U students, and Bob Cook is in there, and I'm sure others of you were there. As Josie said, I'm with a group now called New Ways Ministry. We're an outreach for LGBTQ plus Catholics and families. That's been around since 1977, and I've been there for about 10 years. And so today I want to talk, I'm bringing my two worlds together, my LGBTQ work and my commitment to nonviolence as a Pax Christi member, because I think they're very interrelated. So I want to talk today sort of in two parts, and then I'm hoping there'll be plenty of time for questions and conversations to hear all your thoughts. The first part, I want to talk about sort of context about what LGBTQ rights look like in the US right now. And I'm going to focus on the anti-trans legislation. And then second, I want to highlight some of the ways that Catholics are involved in what's going on in the US and how we might invest ourselves in this work for equality as sort of part of our commitment to live out Catholic social teaching and our commitment to nonviolence and peace and justice. So to begin setting some context, and some of this you likely know, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, but what we have to admit to ourselves, and I think this is important, is that the landscape on LGBTQ activism has changed in recent years, and it's reshaping not only this topic, but the political landscape in the US. As of April, there were somewhere between 450 and 550 bills in state legislatures that targeted the rights of sexual and gender diverse people. And so to compare that to last year, it was only 180. And 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, different political situation, it was just 42 bills. So we've just seen an explosion this year, which is not even half over in this type of legislation. And there are federal bills introduced, but I'm sort of putting those aside because there's limited movement. What's really happening is at the state and local level. Most of this legislation that's being proposed is related to healthcare and education, particularly involving transgender youth. So there are efforts to restrict what is taught in schools. Florida's bill has been colloquially called Don't Say Gay, to mandate educators forcibly out LGBTQ students to parents, to ban books and any discussion of LGBTQ people or history. Legislators are trying to stop trans youth from receiving gender-affirming health care, to ban drag shows, to force people, trans people, to use public accommodations like restrooms that don't align with their gender. And all of this, each of it separately and taken together cumulatively, really does endanger LGBTQ people. You think about an instance where a teacher might be forced to out a child to non-affirming parents that can lead to abuse. You know, the leading reason for youth homelessness is LGBTQ youth on the streets, often because of religious parents, and not just endangering, but diminishing young people's well-being. If they're not able to see positive models of rainbow families in books and in discussions, they may not see a place for themselves. In some of the worst cases, some of this legislation goes as far to essentially criminalize being transgender in public. And we're just really starting to see what the impact of some of this strict legislation can be. Thankfully, there's this onslaught of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, but only about 65 laws of this roughly 500 have passed, and that is in a limited number of states. Likely we'll see more pass as the year progresses. Seems like every week there's one or two more, but it's not, the wave hasn't been as successful as I think sort of opponents of equality have hoped. And
hey, Bob,
yes,
excuse the interruption. Did
please.
you have a slideshow you wanted to share?
Oh my gosh, I'm clicking the slides and they're not even up. So sorry, Bob, thank you. Okay, sorry about that, folks. So this I'll show you, I'll go back. This is a graph showing the surge of anti-LGBTQ legislation that I was talking about, just to give you a visual of how fast this has progressed. So there's all of this bad news. On the other hand, some states are expanding protections as a result. So in Maryland here, our governor just signed the Trans Health Equity Act, which enables Medicaid recipients to receive gender-affirming care. Minnesota is positioning itself as a refuge state for trans people seeking healthcare or safety, and they've just passed legislation that prevents negative state laws from other states from interfering with a trans person who might come to Minnesota for medical care. They also, I think, passed a conversion therapy ban. So, where are Catholics in the midst of all of this? What are Catholics doing? I want to highlight 6 areas. Sort of, some of these overlap. They're not sort of, disparate areas, but I sort of break them down into different areas we could talk about. So the first I want to talk about is healthcare. 1 in 6 hospital beds in the US are in a Catholic health system. 4 of the 10 largest health systems in the US are Catholics. If you're in some rural areas, the share of patient beds can exceed 40 or 50%. Why does this matter? You may know that Catholic hospitals are governed by what are known as the ethical and religious directives for Catholic health services put out by the US bishops. And these directives dictate what services Catholic hospitals may or may not provide. Most often, you've probably heard about these in the context of reproductive care, abortion and birth control. But more recently and increasingly, the ERDs, as they're known, have been used to prevent gender transition care or assisted reproductive technology for queer couples. And one of the troubling things is that patients may not even realize that they are in a hospital governed by the US bishops' directives. With all the healthcare mergers that are happening, if you went to a hospital, St. Joseph's, you probably know it's Catholic. But in Kentucky, there's a hospital called Jewish Hospital that was bought by a Catholic system and is now governed by Catholic directives. But you probably would have no idea. The patients show up not realizing there are these restrictions on care. And one note is, last month, the Bishops' Conference Committee on Doctrine released a note, not formal teaching, but just sort of a guidance on gender-affirming care for Catholic healthcare. And it essentially seeks to bar Catholic institutions from providing any help with gender transitions. So this is sort of an emerging thing. So the second area I want to talk about is the courts. And you've probably heard of some of the high-profile cases that have made it to the Supreme Court. You might have heard of Masterpiece Cake Shop a few years ago. And there's another one, similar case, 303 Creative v. Elenis. And the US bishops and Catholic organizations have signed on as supporters of these right-wing legislative initiatives. So 303 Creative, like Masterpiece Cake Shop, is basically a challenge to non-discrimination laws by religious people with religious objections, and they're trying to test how wide a religious exemption in this country should be when it comes to non-discrimination protections. The goal is to create wide religious exemptions, including ensuring that religious organizations can discriminate while receiving public funds. You may remember a case in 2021, Supreme Court case, Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, which is Catholic social services there wanted to discriminate against LGBTQ people interested in adoption or foster care. And they won that case. So they can still get city money without having to abide by the city's non-discrimination protections. A third area is Catholic education. And the church's impact here is enormous. So in a given year, almost 2.5 million students will be in Catholic schools from, kindergarten all through college. And the reality is, at this point, many of the students and faculty and staff are not Catholic, and yet they're subject to church teachings. In many cases, there are schools that, rely on the church's social justice teachings and provide a more affirming experience. But discrimination is still pretty widespread. And more than overt discrimination, there's just a lack of supporting gender and sexual diverse students with the resources that they need. I'd also highlight something that's happening just to pay attention to is that outside of Catholic systems, Catholic church and lay leaders are pushing for public policy changes. They're seeking to privatize public education with school choice and voucher programs. So you're redirecting public funds to private, potentially religious schools. And the problem here is that often these schools are exempt from non-discrimination laws, which is not only for LGBTQ identities, but potentially we're testing out, are they bound by non-discrimination laws for race, gender, disability? The arguments that these right-wing people are making would just eviscerate basically any protections for any marginalized community in Catholic institutions, Catholic schools, and yet they want to receive, public money. A fourth area are diocesan policies or, internal policies that the church is implementing. And in the last couple of years, we've seen several dozen dioceses implement policies related to gender identity. And largely, these are restrictive policies. Think of any part of church life: sacraments, pastoral care, volunteering, schools, renting out a church hall. These policies are trying to sort of take LGBTQ people and create, at best, a sort of separate but equal system, and at worst, just full exclusion for them.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So
12.
the next area is political advocacy, and you may know something about this. The institutional church is very involved with legislative and political work at all levels of government. Right now, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, it's worked against marriage equality in the past. It's objecting to the Equality Act, which would make non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people federalized. The Bishops' Conference is also opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, in part because it would protect trans people. And this is happening at the state level too, with Catholic conferences and some bishops within their diocese. And largely the claim is that expanding equality for gender and sexual minorities would infringe on the religious liberty of the church to live out its ministries, which is taken to just an extreme degree. So that political advocacy is having a real impact, even though the number of Catholics is diminishing. And you would think the institutional church is not as powerful as it once was. It's probably not, but it still has significant weight when it's talking to legislators and government officials. The last area I want to talk about is what is going on with grassroots Catholics. To this point, I've talked generally about ways that the church has negatively impacted LGBTQ people. And I want to talk a little bit about another story, which is more positive. When we broaden out from the hierarchy to the entire people of God, the situation in the US changes. So the Public Religion Research Institute put out recent data, and it shows that a significant majority of Catholics support non-discrimination protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I think 75% support marriage equality. These numbers have increased rapidly in recent years, and they keep climbing. In the past 5-10 years, it's just been incredible to see the shift. And I know anecdotally, these are numbers, but I also see in my work with New Ways, and I know many folks on the call today are involved with parish ministries. You see the ways that Catholics, not just queer Catholics, but family members and allies are working each day to make the church a more hospitable place through parish ministries and school curricula, and participating in political advocacy as Catholics in the public square. So I want to highlight for us a few of the most positive examples to give us some idea of what is happening to push back against the anti-transgender sort of movement in the US. So a wonderful thing that happened just in March was 6,000 women religious put out a joint statement for Transgender Day of Visibility, which was March 31st. And, the sisters basically highlighted the tough moment we are in politically, the discrimination and violence that trans people are facing, and express their solidarity. And they write movingly at one point, the gospel call of unifying love compels us to actively interrupt harmful interactions in daily life and dismantle the systems that reinforce this rhetoric in violence and society. So I think that's something, Catholic women religious have always been leading on LGBTQ inclusion in the church, and they're just taking that next step to be absolutely, supportive of trans and non-binary people. Higher up, there are some bishops who are sort of breakaway folks from the larger, bishops conference. You'll see here our Pax Christi USA Bishop President, John Stowe, joined with Archbishop John Wester, who was at Pax Christi's National Conference last year. And they signed a letter in 2021 expressing their, how dissatisfied they were with the state of violence and discrimination that trans people were facing. And they importantly made the statement as, US church leaders that trans people are made in the image of God and image God, and that God loves every gender diverse person. This is something we need more of from bishops. So one of the things I would recommend is, if you can, talk to your local ordinary and see if they're willing to be more supportive and more outspoken. That is the case here in DC. Cardinal Gregory was responding to a trans person at a Theology on Tap event, and said this trans person had said, I feel very excluded. What do I do? I want to remain Catholic. And the cardinal said, you're at the heart of this church. You're part of the family. Even Pope Francis has been very supportive of pastoral ministry for trans people, even if he's made some more theoretical comments about sort of gender ideology that are harmful. But In practice, he then goes out and meets with trans people a number of times. He's written several supportive letters to an Argentinian nun, Monica Astorga, who runs housing and social service for trans women, often helping them transition out of sex work. The Pope also invited a group of trans people, largely immigrants who were being cared for at a parish outside Rome, to come to the Vatican and receive COVID vaccines. So, you see headlines, the Pope is condemning gender ideology, and that is very real, and we have to counter that. But the Pope is also showing us that despite our theological difference, the pastoral path is what we need to be taking in terms of our initial response. And finally, I want to highlight what happened in Germany. You may know that there is a process called the Synodal Way that's been happening for about 3 to 4 years. Started before and is different from the sort of global synod that Francis has called. The Germans started this process in the wake of a very damning report on clergy sexual abuse in the country. And lots of issues of power and authority and representation and inclusion have been brought up. Recently, at its final assembly, they approved a text on gender diversity, and it was approved by a large majority of the assembly, which is bishops and lay people together, and included 2/3 of the bishops approving this document, which was necessary for its passage. And you'll see the recommendations are phenomenal. I mean, they're just really calling for the absolute full inclusion of trans and non-binary people in the church, from everything as mundane as changing church records, to protecting trans church workers, to opening all ministries, including ordained ministries, to trans, intersex, and non-binary people. This is just, if you want to know where sort of the cutting edge of the church on gender is, the Germans are where it's at. So I will close by mentioning 2 things. One, in a few years ago, New Ways put out a statement signed by several hundred theologians and church leaders making the case for why LGBTQ non-discrimination is consistent with our faith and why we should be active in it. And if you're sort of wondering, I don't have time today to break down all the arguments, but if you're wondering, how do you make this case? You can go on our website and find the statement, A Home for All, or you can be in touch with me and I'll help you, find it. This is probably the point many of you already know, particularly if you're in LGBTQ ministry, but when we're doing this work, when we're pushing back against anti-trans legislation or trying to develop parish ministry or seeking Catholic schools to include LGBTQ people from history in their curricula, all of this comes from our faith. It's not that we're Catholic and we're objecting to the church. And this crowd, I don't really have to explain the social justice tradition to necessarily. You're all well imbued with the church's long social teaching tradition, and we can point to elements of it like human dignity and the common good and equality of persons to make our case. But I want to say, particularly as a Pax Christi member in a crowd of Pax Christi members, I think our commitment to nonviolence is one of the things in LGBTQ ministry that needs more a higher profile, that we bring that to the discussion that other groups may not know as much. Because a lot of what we're facing today, as has happened in previous eras and then was on the decline, but rates of violence, outright violence, are increasing. But there is also, as the US bishops wrote in the 90s when they were a little more positive, and Pax Christi USA and New Ways joined up for a joint statement after Matthew Shepard was killed, to call for an end to anti-gay prejudice and hate, and cited the bishop's document, which says violence isn't just, a hate crime that's violent. Discrimination is a slow form of violence that wears at people over time. And I think we all know, there are moments of outright violence, but then we know all about the small ways, the daily ways that chip away at peace and justice through, the military industrial complex and the continued development of nuclear weapons, all of these things that sort of out of sight, but wear down our ability to develop the common good. The same is true for LGBTQ people. A lot of these things will not result in someone being murdered on the street, although that happens, but it's, housing insecurity. Am I going to lose my job? Will I, lose my children because adoption rights aren't there? These are also forms of violence that we have to be attentive to. So the last thing I'll conclude is just this reflection from a trans church worker, Michael Sennett, who's a friend of mine. And Michael wrote this for the New Ways Ministry blog a few weeks ago. And it's just a recognition of the need to be persistent in our love as Jesus was, even if our church's leaders and some of our fellow Catholics are unwilling to see the beauty and the sacredness of LGBTQ identities. So with that, I thank you for hearing me out. I know I probably went over things pretty quickly, so I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'd also love to hear, I know some folks are doing LGBTQ ministry or, might have, this issue might touch your lives in some ways. So I'm happy to also hear what you have to say. But thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And if anybody wants to, make a comment or ask Bob a question, maybe if you could, raise your hand either manually or using the React Zoom. And Bob, you could just call on people if that's okay.
Sure. Art, yeah. I think you're muted.
Sorry there. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I thought there were 2 or 3 things that you might add in or ask. I want to ask about other institutions in the church, such as the Knights of Columbus. I don't know how powerful and influenced the Knights are. They've always been extremely conservative on every issue, against every issue that I stand for. So that's number 1. Number 2, you didn't mention anything about religious orders, male and female. I don't think you did anyway. And I'm also particularly interested in, there's an organization called the Ignatian Solidarity Network, which is an organization of Catholic high schools and colleges, which has refused to take any positions on militarism, unfortunately, since they left Georgia, at least, the School of the Americas. I don't know if they've taken this issue on or not. Do you know if they have? And again, have the Jesuits or other orders, male orders, and have presumably Catholic women's orders taken positions? So Catholic orders and positions, Ignatian Solidarity Network, and Knights of Columbus.
Sure. I'll try to do each one. The Knights of Columbus are interesting because, kind of ever since, well, for a while, but particularly with the Bush administration and the close ties that Carl Anderson had with Bush folks, and that carried on, at the national level, the Knights of Columbus have been very active in sort of right-wing activities. They were, I think they spent like $1.5 million just in California for Prop 8, was trying to suppress marriage equality. And I know significant funding went to other anti-marriage equality initiatives in 2012, and they funded other work. The interesting thing is, though, I don't think a lot of Knights at the local level are aware of what's going on with their money. When we had in 2012, there were 4 referenda in states over marriage equality. And, we had Knights of Columbus who were like, wait, my money's, I have a gay grandchild. I don't want the Knights funding this, so they either stopped paying dues or left, or, their local council sort of said, we're not going to participate. So the Knights are a mixed bag. I mean, at the national level, yes, very conservative. When you get down to the grassroots, I think a lot of Knights are exactly where other Catholics are in terms of wanting an inclusive church that cares for often their friends and family members. Religious orders. New Way's ministry would not exist without the support of women religious for over 4 decades. It is the sisters who have led the church on LGBTQ inclusion for a long, long time. And there are some very prophetic, women who have been involved, but also just community and investment, whole communities that say this is something we're working for. The men's communities are quieter, although they exist. In recent years, you probably know James Martin, the Jesuit priest who's started LGBTQ ministry. And there are some men's orders that do sort of quieter work on this. But for whatever reason, the nuns are always far beyond the male religious, not on just on this issue, but on many issues of peace and justice. They're just more outspoken, and there's probably many different reasons for that. But that's just the reality. And in terms of ISN, the Ignatian Solidarity Network, they in 2012, 2013, New Ways did a workshop at their teach-in. And I remember the teach-in back in Georgia, which was very different than the nice Marriott teach-in that they have in Northern Virginia, where it's very cozy. But New Ways did a workshop back then, and we were the only LGBTQ thing. And then over the years, they've sort of broadened the offerings, and I jokingly call it Jesuit Pride now, because they have many workshops for not only students but teachers and campus ministers, and they're just very, very affirming. They've had queer speakers on the main stage, and so they're very good, at least on that front. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for all that.
Of course. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We really appreciate all your comments. One of the things I know we have a concern about too is things aren't good in this country, but especially I'll pick on the global South in some areas of that, where they don't have as much governmental protection, LGBTQ people. We're very concerned about the church's negative influence in some of those more conservative areas where you have more conservative Catholic church. So I don't know if whatever comments that you would like to make on any of that, I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, the situation internationally, Catholic Church, we're everywhere. And so Catholics are involved in some of the worst initiatives out there. There are still 70 or so countries that criminalize just being gay. Many of these places it's not enforced, but some places it certainly is. And just having the law on the books creates sort of an air of hostility and shame and quietness. One example is Uganda, where it's particularly bad. Uganda has a significant Catholic population, and the bishops have a lot of power there. And Uganda just passed legislation that's been bouncing around for 10 years or so to enhance penalties on for homosexuality. And in certain cases, I think they call it aggravated homosexuality, which I'm not sure what that is, but if it's aggravated being gay, there is the imposition of the death penalty, actually is in the And the law isn't fully in effect as of last week or week before. I think the president was sort of like, maybe we hold off on that part because a lot of our international donors and stuff are raising alarms. But the Catholic part of it is the bishops early on, when this law looked like it was going to pass initially, including the death penalty provision, said, we don't really have a stance. We're going to have to meet and like look at the details and discuss it, and we'll let you know. And that is the case with several Catholic bishops' conferences, largely in Africa, that have sort of taken stances that are very, very anti-gay. Elsewhere, particularly like in several Latin American countries, in several Asian countries, certainly in Europe, you know, there's a group called the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, and it has 40 to 50 groups that are specifically Catholics doing LGBTQ work. And a lot of those now are in Latin America. So the movement for equality is not just a global North thing anymore. It is expanding, but yeah, certainly there are pockets of the global South that have some of these harsh laws. Although I always like to remind people, you know, same-gender intimacy only became legal everywhere in the United States in 2003. We are not that far. We're only 20 years from the moment when it used to be criminal to be gay in this country. So, you know, as bad as it is in some areas, I just sort of want to remind us that, you know, we're not that far from it. And some people are saying with the Supreme Court the way it is, the case Lawrence v. Texas that shot down all of those criminalization laws here might be up for discussion in a few years if we're on the current trajectory. So it could become criminal to be gay again. Kurt.
Hi, my question goes in different directions, and I noticed that Luann raised her hand while you were talking. So Luann, is your question direct related to this topic? And if it's so, it might be better to handle yours first.
My hand was up because of late, I've been involved in seeing a teaching course on science and religion and the conflict, supposed conflict. But what I've been impressed about is that it's often the theologians that have things to say that are very persuasive in the end. And I was wondering, are there some theologians that are talking about this conflict and putting it in a different perspective of the church that might be helpful for people to use as a resource?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of lesbian, gay, bisexual identities, you've got a decades-long trajectory of Catholic theologians coming out with more affirming positions. You know, I highlight, if you're looking for a defense of queer relationships, Sister Margaret Farley, a Mercy sister and renowned theologian, has a book called Just Love that incorporates sort of contemporary science and our understandings of the world today to make the case for an affirming stance for queer relationships. And it's based on social justice. Is the relationship just and right? Rather than an older Catholic moral tradition that many ethicists on many issues are putting aside, which is very acts-based, outside of any sort of broader context or broader relationships. It's just singular acts-focused. A lot of theologians and ethicists are moving to understand we need to look at things with a broader picture, look at them, how they relate to social justice, how they relate to contemporary science and our understandings of the world, and how they relate to the broader church tradition, not just sort of the very narrow moral tradition that sort of is the last few hundred years as it got very tight. On trans identities, there is sort of a slower, and it's only really emerged in the last few years that it's gotten some prominence, But there are theologians like Craig Ford and Elizabeth Sweeney Block and Dan Horan who are presenting more positive ways of looking at gender diversity in our theological reflection. And they all do things, they all come from sort of different places, and like it'd be a lot to get into now, but if you're looking to read more, be in touch and I can give you some resources. Yeah, Kurt.
Okay, yeah, okay. Two of my 4 children are LGBTQ, and all 4 of them essentially have rejected the church, primarily because of its teaching on LGBTQ. And I've also noticed that I was shocked to see in the Synod documents summary of what's been found, very, very encouragingly shocked that actually that seems to be a major issue among most Catholics, is how the church is treating LGBTQ. And I also, you put up a statistic that said 82% of Catholics think are opposed to this anti stuff. Now, when you say 8, and just in my experience among Catholics, that doesn't seem to be the case, and that is that strong. So when you said Catholics, does that mean the Catholics as defined those who are practicing and those who are not practicing? Do you know how that was defined in that survey?
Yeah, so PRI usually means Catholics, doesn't differentiate between practicing and non-practicing. It's anyone who claims a Catholic identity. So, there are other surveys that break down, do you attend mass each week? And what do you think do you receive communion each day? Do you, interestingly, none of those surveys ever ask, do you do the corporal works of mercy? Do you go out and, seek to make the world a more just place? It's always limited to, do you go to mass each week? So there's many different ways you can break down Catholic identity. PRI just says self-identity, basically. Do you claim that you are a Catholic?
Oh, okay. Then actually that would, because I'm not sure my children would claim that at this point if they answer that survey. But on another point, is there any outreach to parish schools, to elementary schools? Because I know even though our daughter didn't mention it at the time, because she actually wasn't quite sure whether that she was a lesbian, but in middle school, she heard lots of negative talk about gay people. Even one of her classmates, she once said, "No, I'd rather be dead than gay." This is just 10 years ago. And this is a parish school in Rockville, Maryland, in which the parish overall was relatively liberal. The school itself was rather conservative. But so I'm just wondering if there's any outreach that your group or any other groups do to try to get into the parish schools and say that, no, we treat each other as everyone has a divine nature because we are Catholic, not in spite of. That was a very encouraging message, and I'm wondering if that has gotten to parish schools.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there are 6,000 Catholic schools in this country. But I will say a lot of schools, particularly middle schools and high schools, are beginning to explore what a more supportive environment would be for not only students who know they're LGBTQ, but students who may be questioning or trying to sort out identity. I can say Catholic colleges, in large part, are the leading edge in terms of just full inclusion. You have your conservative schools, but many schools now have LGBTQ support staff, even centers, queer, theology courses. So Catholic higher ed is a great spot. But high schools and increasingly middle schools are starting to realize they need to offer, different services for students. We do workshops for Catholic schools. We come in and lead a discernment process about what steps they could take to, realistically improve right now the support they're offering. And just a broader point, though, I think when we're talking about book bans and changing to curricula and the Don't Say Gay bills, you don't need to teach elementary school students, about being gay. I mean, they're probably too young at 5, although many trans people say they knew from a very young age, 4 or 5, about their identity. But age appropriate education is totally part of it. But you've got to start introducing diverse gender identity, diverse family structures. And I'm not talking just queer couples, but couples with divorce in the family and different family arrangements, exposure from a young age to all of these sort of diverse representations of identity and family, particularly if students are brought up in a religious context. That makes it easier when they do start to encounter, whether it's questions with their own identity or their peers, they've sort of normalized that, oh, having 2 moms is kind of just part of being human. So Catholic schools need to are involved in that same fight that a lot of states are doing, of trying to just blanket cut out LGBTQ people, identities, family structures from exposure to children. And it's a huge problem. Yeah. Ryan.
Thank you, Bob. A couple of questions. Back to the statistics from PRI. What are your findings in regards to the support of LGBTQ from people of color, Black and brown Catholics, number one? And number two, does the PRI deal at all with non-Catholic faith traditions, and what does support look like there? That's a 2-part question. The other one is a little bit of a commercial, but as you know, we have this group here in Baltimore called All Are Welcome. It's been going on for 6 years, came out of the Social Ministry Convocation, which is held every year. And currently we have 16 parishes that have or are working towards having an active LGBT ministry in the Archdiocese. And while we are also disappointed in regards to the USCCB, the vice president of that organization, who is our Archbishop, William Laurie, seems to be giving us enough room that we can continue this ministry of All Are Welcome. And in fact, is gently encouraging us to open other ministries around the Archdiocese. And so that's a little bit of a mixed bag. We're not quite sure sometimes where the motivation is coming from, because I'm sure he gets a lot of pressure from his brother bishops about what he's doing here in the Baltimore Archdiocese. So your comments about All Are Welcome, and then also the statistics about the ecumenical feeling of people of faith and people of color.
Yeah. At least from PRI's work, Latinx Catholics tend to be actually the most supportive group. I think Latinx Catholics, if overall general Catholics are 82, I think Latinx Catholics were like 86% in support of non-discrimination protections. And that, support has been pretty consistent, that Latinx Catholics are sort of on the outer positive edge for LGBTQ stuff. And it bodes well for the church, given that, we are in this demographic shift where Latinx Catholics are the US Catholic Church, not white Catholics anymore. Black Catholics tend to be a little bit less affirming, not by a ton. I think they might be 76, 78% in that particular survey. So, you sort of see there is a range in terms of, when you break down not just by race, but by location, by gender, I mean, the 82% is sort of a national average. Pockets of this country are far more affirming, pockets are far less affirming. So a lot of it is contextual. In terms of other faith traditions, this may not seem the case if you're sort of in the church, but Catholics tend to be more supportive than a lot of faith traditions, particularly other Christian denominations. Atheists, humanists, Jews, Sikhs sort of tend to be much more further out in terms of affirmation. But then amongst Christians, you have the mainline Protestants that are fairly affirming. But Catholics are sort of right there, at least statistically, in terms of support. And then far beyond, white evangelicals and some of the more conservative churches, obviously. Yeah, Frank.
It's good. Good morning, and thank you so much for your presentation. I had two kinds of questions. One was going back to Catholic education and what the outreach is to after school, the Catholic education that goes on for public school students, and also for RCIA. I've been a catechist for many years in Bob's church at St. Rose, and I've noticed that it's actually never come up in any kind of direction to us. And so therefore we do whatever we want. But is that purposeful, or is there any other direction?
So in terms of faith formation outside of Catholic schools, I don't have any clear picture of what's going on. I think I'll say this, as a parish goes, so goes a lot of the pastoral activity. So if a pastor is supportive, if there's an LGBTQ ministry, that will sort of infuse into a lot of the other programs. St. Cecilia's in Boston is a great example of this. When they shifted from the Jesuit Urban Center, which closed, which is where the LGBTQ ministry was, they went to St. Cecilia's, and the pastor there said, well, I'm not going to create a little community just for you. You have to be part of the entire community. And so that affirmation has sort of spilled into all of the other programming they do. And I think that's the case for many parishes. I would say one thing in terms of faith formation, whether it's for children or RCIA, one of the things I always emphasize is be proactive. Don't wait for LGBTQ issues to come up, but maybe try to introduce them, even if it's just a small part, because often people may be reluctant to bring them up. But if you bring them up in a more positive way, then people open up. And then their questions come, and then their need to learn more. But I think if people don't know, particularly if they're younger or they're coming into the church or they've been hurt by the church, they might sort of have those questions, need that learning, but be unwilling to put themselves out there without sort of the invitation.
All right, thank you for that. My second question was completely different, and that's talking about the infrastructure to have a dialogue with the Catholic healthcare system. Is there anything, are there open pipelines where this thing can really just be discussed in a non-confrontational kind of way?
So the Catholic Health Association is trying to foster some conversation around better LGBTQ healthcare, particularly gender transition care. How successful it's going to be, I don't know. I think they might have been involved in this Bishops' Conference doctrinal note on gender care and tried to tamp that down or something, but there's not a broad-based conversation yet. And a lot of what is happening is this is being adjudicated in the courts. People face discrimination, they sue the Catholic health system. whether it, state or federal court, and that's how it's being adjudicated. And I just, Frank, I think there's a better way where we could have an internal dialogue in the church and get to a place where it isn't just litigation. So I think we're at time.
Yeah.
If I can just throw up, someone asked for my email. I'll just throw up and refer you to a couple resources. So this is my information. I also put it in the chat. I think Bob put in my personal email and I put in my work email. You're welcome to write to both. I am much more negligent of my personal email. So if you want a really quick response, you can write to the New Ways email. And if you are willing to wait a couple days, you can write to the personal email. And I just want to let you know, newwaysministry.org is our website. We have all kinds of resources. We have a list of LGBTQ friendly parishes. We have issue pages. We have church teaching. We have a scriptural reflection series aimed at LGBTQ people. So, feel free to check that out. We also have a daily blog that has Catholic LGBTQ news that comes out each morning. And it's an archive also dating back to 2011. So if you're looking up a particular case or a particular issue, you can sort of search that. And we've got over 10 years of documented happenings. And then finally, one last thing is this booklet, A Home for All. I mentioned the statement on non-discrimination that came out and was signed by those theologians and church leaders. We turned it into a Q&A book. So if you're looking for yourself or perhaps for someone else, why do Catholics support LGBTQ stuff? This sort of breaks it down into manageable chunks in that Q&A format. So, and you can find that on our website. And if you're looking for something in particular, if you're in need of a consultation with work that you're doing, if you're looking for a certain resource, if you have a question, that is what we are there for. We are a resource hub to help people do work in their communities. So do reach out to New Ways. And I thank you all very much for having us, for the Council's commitment to including LGBTQ inclusion in your work. That is so wonderful. And yeah, be in touch if you need anything.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank everybody for spending an hour on this important topic on the first Saturday of May. So we really appreciate everybody coming. We thank Bob for his great presentation. If we can, if anybody, I don't know if Bob's got a couple of minutes, and if anybody else wants to, we'll try to keep the Zoom open for a few minutes. Does Josie, did you want to lead us out in prayer, or did you? It's up to you.
Yes, Bob. I'll lead us in prayer, and then we can leave the Zoom open in case if people have time to hang out. And thank you again, Bob, so much. Thanks again to everyone that is here. Let us center ourselves. Awaken us to the oneness of all things, to the beauty and truth of unity. May we become aware of the interdependence of all living things and come to know you in everything and all things in you. For as we attune to your presence within us, we know not separation, and joy becomes a dwelling place. For it was you who formed our inward parts. You knit us together in our mother's wombs. We praise you, for we are fearfully and wonderful made, each and every one of us. Wonderful are your works that we know very well. Our frames are not hidden from you. When we were being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. May we become bearers of joy, we who are invited to share in the cosmic dance. May we walk in faith all the days of our lives, confident in your divine presence, even in times of trouble, and with assurance for what is and what is to be. May we have faith in the unfolding of our lives and radical trust in the universe. Amen.
Amen. Amen, everybody. God bless. Take care. Thank
Amen.
you again, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Judith, go ahead.
It was great. Thank you, Bob Shine. I remember those days back at the School of the Americas. You said something that made me want to ask why. Germany on the cutting edge of progressive policies and thoughts. Can you go a little further there? How did that happen?
Yeah. Okay, I'll start way back. When in Weimar, Germany, I know this is a tangent, but just bear with me.
Okay.
In Weimar, Germany, it was the leading center of sexuality and gender research. It was actually in the 20s and early 1930s that the first gender transition surgeries were done. The first library that the Nazis, sort of street thugs burned was an Institute for Human Sexuality. So Germany has this tradition of being more progressive in terms of thought. Now, clearly that changed and that trajectory changed. And, homosexuality was criminalized under the Nazis. And then in the post-World War II states, there was also sort of a criminalization. But there is that trajectory in sort of German society that's been reclaimed. In addition, German theologians, Catholic theologians, have been historically some of the more progressive folks. Not entirely. Pope Benedict came from that tradition, but you have folks like Karl Rahner who were really pushing the edges of Catholic theology, maybe not specifically on gender and sexuality, but theology whole scale. And then some of those folks were doing work on sexuality. The immediate trigger was what's called the MHG study in 2019, which was sort of like, if you remember 2002, when the Boston Globe stories broke clergy sexual abuse in Boston, the MHG study had the same impact in Germany. And in Germany, you have to register to be Catholic. And then actually the church is funded because they take taxes from your paycheck and give them to the church. So the German church is fabulously wealthy. The number of Catholics they were losing, 250, 300,000 Catholics year over year. So there was sort of this crisis. And the German bishops convened with what's known as the Central Committee of German Catholics, which is a very powerful lay group. I mean, a lot of countries don't have the structure. They don't have a lay committee that is as powerful as the bishops' conference, if not more so. They don't have the type of money that allows them to have this, professional journalism organization, to have some of the wealthiest charitable organizations. So Germany is sort of this unique place where the confluence of all these factors, I think, came together, and the German bishops, recognized, just like the rest of us Catholics do, that the church is in crisis and major changes were needed. And they were willing to take that risk, but they were also bolstered by a long German tradition that, sort of has resurged about being open to diverse gender and sexuality, progressive theology, and then the sort of needle that broke, with the MHG study.
Excellent answer. Thank you.
Yeah, Mary.
Just because we're in free time, my Jewish husband wouldn't believe anything good about the Germans if he could help it. But the last chapter of Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, which is one of the best books I've read in the last few years, draws a very strong contrast between the way that we are, in many cases, hugging to hugging our history of racism and keeping it to our bosoms, and the way that they have dealt with Holocaust education. And it's just phenomenal. So they're also leaders in green technology. There's a very strong progressive strain in German culture. And I think maybe it's partly because of the Holocaust and having to really put that behind them, and not half the population, you know, as we are with slavery, wanting to sweep it under the rug, or worse, or sustain it, expand on it. God help us.
Yeah, it's a great point and a great book if you haven't read it. Yeah. Yeah, Charlene.
Hi, Bob. I really appreciate you bringing this. I learned a lot and not what I expected to learn. So I really appreciate that too. And it resonates with me because one of the, besides the personal situations that take place in any family, but you know, our Catholic families, of when our children reveal to us, or we find out that they are pursuing, or you know, that their gender is different or their identity is different, you know, that's always going to be a struggle, as many things are when you're raising kids.
Yep.
Something that's my husband and I experienced was that there's a young woman in our church whom we did not know, but we really didn't care because we knew her, we loved her, we've been around her family. You know, she's going to get married and she had been bringing her partner to church and all of that. But then what got really resonated with my husband and I is that there was no marriage prep for them.
Mm-hmm.
There was, and we were really disturbed by that, because it's like, okay, well, yeah, I know they can't get married in the church, but they're going to have the same, if not additional things to have to work through in determining whether marriage, you know, they've thought it through, and where their faith resonates with them, with all those, you know, all the things. And so, you know, we reached out to them to provide some input as best we could, but it was, you know, it's the things that you don't realize till they're right there, that people have to face and struggle through. And it is not that she doesn't want to be Catholic, but it's like now the church has just abandoned her, you know, with no one to really address that, the marriage part, because we're trying to support young people being married in the church for one thing, but then, you know, in this particular situation. And, you know, while we were also trying to support the parents who were struggling with all of that themselves. So I'm just really glad to hear more information that helps us personally continue to form with this, and to be present to people whom we're involved with. And I would also say, since I'm an educator, I'm at a Catholic school, I also am thanking God right now that I'm at the school that I am, because we don't make it an issue. It's the same as any other teenage thing that's going on in a high school with teenage people. We love them through their things. And we tried, and our approach has always been, who are you as a person? And is whatever you're doing bringing you what you need to be successful in the world, or is it doing the opposite? But we don't speak in terms of any discriminatory issues with regard to them. We address any issues that might be discriminating, or you know, anything like kids would, any other kids would. So I'm just feeling really blessed about that environment at Archbishop Carroll that we have, I think, maintained without, just out of our Christian imperative and our Catholic imperative, you know, doing what Christ has asked us to do, and love them as best we could and can, so that they graduate and can go on and live the rest of their lives. So I really appreciate this, and I'm glad I have your information.
Yeah.
So you can be a constant source for us.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlene. Sounds like you're doing good work at church and at school. So that's great.
So Bob, we have really taken your time and we would like to thank you so much. And thanks again to everyone who stayed on. Bob, thank you for the work you continue to do, and the same for everyone else. Stay well. God bless everyone and take care.
Thank you for having me. Have a
Thanks,
good rest of the
Josie.
day.
Thanks, Bob Shine.
Bye.
Thank you. Yay.